But there is also something paradoxical about the very idea of death as a condition in which every individual life and mind terminates. And my purpose now is to explore that paradox. The philosopher Tom Clark has a wonderful essay which you can read on his website, naturalism.org. And the essay is titled Death, Nothingness, and Subjectivity. And I want to explore his argument here in some detail. Of course, other philosophers and scientists have said many things on this point. For instance, we have the famous quotation from Epicurus, as we encounter him in Lucretius's poem on the nature of things. Quote, "Death is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not. And when death exists, we are not. All sensation and consciousness ends with death, and therefore in death there is neither pleasure nor pain." End quote. So this idea of nothingness, of oblivion, of a dark abyss, of a kind of positive absence, of an endless deprivation of experience, is misleading if we're simply talking about the end of experience. You didn't experience your absence before you were born. And if death is truly the end of experience, you won't experience your absence after you die. So this reification of death as eternal nothingness is fundamentally misleading. And Clark starts his essay there. The philosopher Wittgenstein made a similar point in disparaging Freud's notion of the unconscious. He said, quote, "Imagine a language in which instead of saying, 'I found nobody in the room,' one said, 'I found Mr. Nobody in the room.' Imagine the philosophical problems that would arise out of such a convention." End quote. That's from the Blue Book. The point is, nothingness isn't something, and therefore it can't be a permanent condition of any being or mind. The second point that Clark explores is the subjective continuity of consciousness. From the point of view of consciousness, there can be no experience of before or after with respect to birth and death. So there is something almost eternal about it from its own point of view. Of course, we think we experience interruptions of consciousness while alive, in sleep or under anesthesia, but that's not quite true. It's true that we experience changes in the character of our experience, that is, in the contents of consciousness. It feels like something to wake up groggy from sleep, say. But from the point of view of consciousness, we just experience one moment after the next, even if some moments indicate that there were periods of time that we can't account for, or did not experience at all. From the point of view of consciousness, there is just subjective continuity. We are, in some sense, always present. Now, there are certain caveats from a meditative point of view, because there are experiences in meditation that are often described as cessation experiences, where seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and touching and thinking and any awareness of the body or the world gets fundamentally interrupted. And depending on the tradition one is practicing in, these episodes are either accorded enormous significance or totally ignored. I would just make the point that they really don't pose a challenge to what Clark is arguing here. If the experience of cessation is truly the absence of experience, well then it can't be experienced. And the continuum of conscious subjectivity will remain undivided from its own point of view. If, on the other hand, there is some qualitative character to these intervals of cessation, however subtle, well then that is another instance of conscious experience, however subtle. In either case, from the point of view of consciousness, we just have one damn thing after the next, even when some of those things indicate that there must have been a preceding gap in the continuum. That is, we lost some hours to sleep, or to anesthesia, or some minutes or moments to some experience of cessation in meditation. In fact, it's not clear to me that consciousness isn't routinely interrupted, even in the normal course of events. And this could be analogous to what happens when we move our eyes several times a second with each visual saccade. When you move your eyes around the visual scene, conscious vision is suppressed during the time of those movements. Otherwise, you'd experience the world lurching around several times a second. And you can see what it would be like if you place your fingers on either side of your eyes and jiggle them manually. Your brain corrects for normal eye movement by suppressing the visual data during each saccade. So our experience of being present in the world, in every other channel, may be more punctate than it seems. And there are certainly experiences one can have in meditation that do make it seem that way. It can seem like everything, including consciousness itself, is arising and passing away in each moment. But again, this is always judged in some way retrospectively based on the qualitative character of consciousness in each subsequent moment. So consciousness itself never has a beginning or ending for itself, from its point of view. And this does have implications for how we think about the nothingness that bounds either side of our lives. As Clark points out, the time before your birth is not an abyss from which you managed to escape. And by the same token, the time after you die cannot be some sort of oblivion. From the point of view of consciousness, there is something eternal about its being what it is. In this moment, from your point of view, there was never a time at which you didn't exist, and there won't be a time at which your existence will end. Okay, so now I'm making the turn toward paradox proper. Let's just review where we are. We have the fact that we should not expect to experience oblivion after death, even if death is synonymous with the end of experience. And we have the fact that consciousness is always present for itself, that it is continuous even if we have good reason to think that it gets interrupted in the case of any specific person. There's one more fact to consider before things get genuinely strange. It's this further fact that consciousness is intrinsically impersonal, because it's merely the light by which anything that is personal is known. And this includes anything you can notice about yourself, your sensory experience, what you see and feel in this moment, or any specific memory or thought. Literally anything you can bring to mind or perceive in this or any other moment, your beliefs, your desires, anything you can notice about yourself that makes you specifically you and not some other person. All of these personal things are merely appearances in consciousness. Consciousness itself is utterly undefined. It's the impersonal condition in which everything else arises. So, recognizing this, Clark suggests, quote, "Instead of anticipating nothingness at death, I propose that we should anticipate the subjective sense of always having been present, experienced within a different context, the context provided by those subjectivities which exist or come into being." End quote. And then to make this very strange and quasi-mystical idea more plausible, he then proposes a kind of Rip Van Winkle thought experiment. Imagine being put to sleep and then being awakened many years or even centuries later. It should be clear that experientially this isn't fundamentally different from what happens to you every night. You would still be you, experiencing the continuity of consciousness. It's just that your circumstance in the world would be very different. But now imagine that changes were made to you during the interval. How much would we have to change about you for us to say that your life ended and that a completely new person has been born? If the changes were minor, well then you would just be the same person waking up with just a few quirks. If the changes are sweeping, well then you would be quite different, but there still seems to be the subjective continuity from the point of view of consciousness. It's just that the contents of consciousness have changed. Your goals, your desires, your memories. Even though the memories of your old life might be gone, it does seem very strange to say that the interval of sleep is now some kind of permanent abyss that is a real death from the point of view of consciousness. Here's what Clark writes, quote, "Although this transformation has disrupted the personal subjective continuity imparted by a stable context of memory and personality, there is another sort of continuity, or sameness, that's created by the shared sense of always having been present. Such generic subjective continuity is independent of the context of memory and personality, that is, of being a particular person, and it amounts simply to the fact that whoever wakes up feels as if they've always been here, that there's been no subjective blank or emptiness in front of their current experience. We can, I think, imagine going to sleep, being radically transformed, and having someone else wake up with no worry about falling into nothingness, even though we no longer exist." End quote. It seems to me that this effect is especially clear if we just skip the interval of sleep. Just imagine if we changed you moment by moment. If we changed each one of your memories and every other personal attribute, one at a time, every second, for the rest of the day. Let's say you don't currently like radishes, but in 14 minutes you will. Let's say you currently remember that you had cereal for breakfast today, but in about an hour you'll recall that you had eggs this morning. At what point in this process of change would we have to say that you had died, and that this new person's experience is no longer subjectively continuous with yours? Is there such a point? Why would there be? There's been no cessation of consciousness. It's just that the context of consciousness has gradually changed. Now, would death come any nearer to you if we started changing your cells? Perhaps by swapping in cells that harbor the DNA of another person? Imagine that consciousness is maintained through this process. Is there a point at which death is real? So sit with that for a second, and now we can leap to the truly strange inference. How are such manipulations any different than what happens when one person dies and another person is born? In this case, too, there's no end to experience from the point of view of consciousness for the first person, nor does the second person who is born experience a prior period of never having existed before. There's just the subjective continuity of consciousness, as and for itself, in either case. And it's intrinsically impersonal. Clark writes, quote, "This thesis implies that even if all centers of awareness were extinguished, and the next conscious creature appeared millions of years hence, perhaps in a galaxy far, far away, there would still be no subjective interregnum. Subjectivity would jump that objective gap just as easily as it jumps the gap from our last experience before sleep to the first upon awakening. All the boring eons that pass without the existence of a subject will be irrelevant for the subject that comes into being, nor will they count as nothingness for all the conscious entities which cease to exist. Subjectivity, awareness, consciousness, experience, whatever we call it, never stops arising as far as it is concerned." And then he goes on later in the essay to make the final point, quote, "Despite my naturalistic and materialist caveats at the beginning of this essay, such a conclusion may seem to have a mystical ring. It may seem as though I give too much weight to the subjective sense of always having been present. And in claiming that subjectivity for itself always is, I ignore the vast times and spaces in which no consciousness exists at all. Nevertheless, I believe a materialist can see that consciousness, as a strictly physical phenomenon instantiated by the brain, creates a world subjectively immune to its own disappearance. It is the very finitude of a self-reflective cognitive system that bars it from witnessing its own beginning or ending. and hence prevents there being, for it, any condition other than existing. Its ending is only an event, and its non-existence a current fact for other perspectives. After death, we won't experience non-being. We won't, quote, fade to black. We continue as the generic subjectivity that always finds itself here, in the various contexts of awareness that the physical universe manages to create. So when I recommend that you look forward to the continuing sense of always having been here, construe that you not as a particular person, but as that condition of awareness, which although manifesting itself in finite subjectivities, nevertheless always finds itself present. End quote.